Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avercan. This day, May 18th, 1927, a horrific act of terror, the Bath, Michigan bombing. This is the moment when an angry school board member dynamited the Bath Consolidated School. Bath is a town just outside of East Lansing, Michigan, if you know that part of the world. Andrew Kehoe, a local 55-year-old farmer, set off explosives first at his home, killing his wife, and then he drove to the school building where he had set up dynamite to demolish that building. And then outside of the school, he blew up his own car as well, killing himself and one other person there. In total, 45 people were killed, among them 38 children. This still stands as the largest mass murder at a school in U.S. history, though we, of course, now live with death after death at schools from guns in this day and age. It's a really tough topic, but it's been on our list for a while, and a lot of people have suggested we touch on the Bath Massacre. So here to do that, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We often on this show do a lot of take the story on its own for what it is and understand it in context. And I want to do that. But I also just largely feel like the way we're interested in this story is because of all the resonances to the violence and school violence we see now. But I suppose we should talk about Andrew Kehoe, who he is, this town, and why he decides to commit this act. So what is, Niki, the biographical sketch as best you know it about this man?
So Kehoe was a farmer, and he was also somebody who was involved in the local community. He had served on the school board. He had picked up a position as the town clerk. He was appointed to that position in 1925. And then when he had run for re-election in 1926, he had lost. So that's kind of what was happening in his life around this time. It's the 1920s. And for listeners who know the state of the economy in the 1920s, particularly for farmers, there was a real crisis in farming following World War I. And so he was hit by that as well, right? Farmers are struggling at this point in time. It's probably also worth noting that he was somebody who had a history of all sorts of antisocial acts, whether it was harming animals, whether it was harming people. There is, particularly after this event, a look back at his life that shows us a biography that is troubled, to put it mildly.
He's married, he has his farm. The farm begins to get foreclosed on, and it's a little inconclusive what pushes him over the edge, if even that's the right way to put it. But, he does seem to target the school because there is a tax in the town that goes to the school, and he basically says, if it weren't for this tax, I might be able to dig myself out of the foreclosure on my farm. And so that's how he gets it in his head that the school should be a target or is somehow responsible for his state of affairs, in addition to kind of this feeling ostracized from the community because he had lost this school board race.
And it's sort of compounding, because I think the school board race, he loses that in April. By June, he realizes that his house is going to be foreclosed on. It's, again, we don't know the exact moment, but he certainly had a season of compounding losses that motivated him to, take up this violent act. He goes and he, purchases dynamite and purchases sort of all of the supplies and equipment that you need to create this explosive. A lot of people may not know that farmers had access to a lot of this stuff as well. So it wouldn't be completely unusual for him to purchase some of the materials, but he figures out how to create this contraption, how to detonate it, and it causes massive amounts of harm.
And it is a fairly, sophisticated is the wrong word, but as people can imagine, bombs are tricky to build and to detonate. And here he has both this explosive, all of this fuel in the form of fertilizer, and then also an alarm clock to help time when this bomb is going to go off. So when we talk in a minute about the devastation and the amount of death that he caused, that was deliberate, right? He wanted to hurt and kill as many people as possible.
Yeah. But the sort of homemade bombs, the bombs as a weapon for quote unquote average people to use, was a sort of hallmark of this era. I mean, I think it's, coming in the wake of the First World War. Dynamite is on the rise, but there's not really an understanding of regulation. And, we've done episodes on, remember that episode we did on the gangsters who were fighting each other in southern Illinois, and they like firebombed one another from a plane?
Yeah.
And that was
I remember
a plane that was left over from the war that they had hijacked, and they were using bombs that had been, that one of them had learned how to do that in the war. So, I mean, there's that kind of like this little moment where these weapons are available and the regulation around them has not caught up. And so this man is able to like accumulate 600 pounds of dynamite and another explosive over the course of a number of months. And then, as you're saying, set up these explosives.
This is also the era of the Wall Street bombing. Like there's just a lot of terroristic violence that's happening in this period.
Yeah, the 600 pounds of dynamite was what they found left over. So there was more than that. The 600 pounds are like what the investigators...
Didn't explode.
Yeah, didn't explode. Can you imagine? I mean, my goodness. Yeah.
So he sets off firebombs in his house and his farm buildings, and they explode, and they even go into the neighbor's house and so forth. His wife dies in that explosion. Then he drives over to the school where he had set up dynamite and pyrotol and had hidden it there with a clock timer on it. And that is when the true devastation hits. He kind of gets there, I think, right after the bombing went off. Everyone's confused. No one really knows what's going on. I think someone walks over to him to talk to him, and then he blows up his own car, which he had set up with dynamite as well.
And the person who walks over to him is the superintendent of the school, somebody who he had had conflict with in the past. So the superintendent survives the initial bombing, but when he approaches Kehoe, that's when Kehoe blows up his car, blows up the superintendent. So he really is on this kind of spree of killing. And look, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about contemporary acts of terrorism is that often the people will, almost always men, will first kill their wife or their mother and then go to the scene of a broader public attack. And that was the case here as well.
And kill themselves what's also devastating is the fact that out of, you mentioned earlier, 45 people are killed, 38 of them are children. Many families have lost multiple children, as you can imagine, siblings going to the same school. So this is really... The entire town is grieving. The entire town sort of turns into a morgue where there's multiple funerals that need to take place. And it really cements this moment of just grief throughout not just the town, all of the state, really, because this becomes national news.
Yeah, I mean, it's covered around the country. It competes with the Charles Lindbergh happens to be going on his trip at this very moment, so it competes with that for headlines around the country.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
All right, now I just for a few minutes, let's turn a little bit to kind of what we see in this story that feels like it's resonant to other moments of terrorism and this moment of school violence and so forth. And, I will say, like, I often find it really hard to talk about this stuff because the subject matter is hard, but also because, I just, at some point you're doing psychologizing about an awful person, and it's just, it's the reason I don't do true crime, and we don't do true crime, but, but I do think it's important to talk about that here. So, again, there's only so much you can know about this man's motivations, but let's start with this kind of like anti-tax, anti-government grievance that is certainly part of the stew there. I mean, we've touched on that so many times. Niki, do you have a sense of like particularly, maybe in the Midwest, in the 20s, in this era? Kind of like, how's that bubbling up?
There certainly is a kind of anti-government sentiment in many pockets of the United States, even over things like compulsory schooling. I mean, one of the things that we see big pushback over in the quasi-Midwest and places like Tennessee is over like the teaching of evolution. And it is a new era of taxation, although at this point, there are local taxes. The income tax has been passed. It hasn't quite passed on to like anyone under the very wealthy yet at this point. That will change in the 1930s. But that kind of anti-government sentiment in an era of kind of a small government ethos in the nation. You see 3 successive Republican presidents who are calling for smaller government. It doesn't necessarily, when we think about the violent expressions of anti-tax or anti-government sentiment, we tend to think more of the 90s with like Timothy McVeigh, for instance, in the Oklahoma City bombing, although there are iterations of this that we see across the 20th century.
What for me stands out is that we've seen lots of, and talked about lots of mass tragedies, mass shootings, mass killings, but many of them have not involved children. And so this sort of stands out in an early moment in which school children are killed while at school. That's way too common and way too disturbingly common in the moment that we live in now. But back then, children were sort of seen as, off the table. Like, it wasn't even considered that you would harm a child. That's what's just so hard to get my brain around now, is like I'm worried about our loss of sensitivity toward not just life in general, but life towards the most vulnerable people.
Yeah.
The other thing that it's kind of resonant of is the bombing of those 4 young girls that we just briefly touched on last week in 1963 in
the Birmingham bombing.
16th
Street Baptist Church, where 4 little girls were killed, on Sunday morning. So churches and schools, places that we think are places of refuge or that are sacred, don't have the same level of protection anymore.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of my reaction to this story too, is the sense of, how do I put this? I mean, it's like you read a story like this and you say, oh gosh, how do we not know about this story? How is it not stuck with us? How has it been lost to history? And that's just the way it is. We lose stories to history, even a story where 38 children die, What's happening now is that we are losing that story every 3 days because it just keeps happening, right? I mean, there was that shooting in Texas. I was reading.
Which one?
I know. I subscribe to the actual newspaper, the New York Times, on the weekends, and I was flipping through the Saturday paper, and page 27 was the mall massacre, where dozens of people were shot. It was just ranked as just a story tucked into the newspaper, And so, I mean, I think,
and these stories hit closer to home. I had mentioned to you before that some members of my church had moved to Dallas, and they were victims of that shooting. All members of their family were killed except their 6-year-old son, and these are heinous acts in which, not just parents are being killed, but 3-year-olds, toddlers, babies. And we have not been able to stop it.
Because after the Bath bombing, you don't see like a surge or a trend of bombings that just make it so that it erases it from memory because you have too many to remember, right? It is this singular event in many ways, not just for the 1920s, but you don't see repeated attacks on schools. And that begins to change slowly on like college campuses in the 1970s, and then by the time Columbine rolls around, it's compounding, right? Year after year after year, there are these mass targeting of schools, so much so that, Kellie, you're right, like increasingly more and more of us know people who have been killed or injured in mass shootings, but we also have, whether they're our own kids or kids that we know who have to go through duck and cover drills in schools, who have to go through active shooter drills. And so even if you don't know somebody who has been targeted in one of these shootings, you almost certainly know somebody who is traumatized by the fact that we constantly have to protect against these shootings, doing not even the bare minimum, doing less than the bare minimum to stop them.
Yeah, the active shooter drills have become like synonymous with Well, the fire drill. We had to do fire drills in school, but the active shooter drills are a part of that now. And yeah, I can't get my mind around that either.
Yeah. And as much as we at a big scale become desensitized, at a community level, that's not possible, right? The trauma is still there for every community that suffers this, including the town of Bath. And interestingly enough, I mean, like a really long legacy to this story, but also, related to that, it wasn't until just a year ago that the last survivor of the Bath bombing, a student who was at the school, died in May of 2022 at the age of 114 years old. Wow. So, the living memory of this was still around until very, very recently.
And I think that's important to recall as we think about like the long tail of trauma, is that the things that are happening today are going to be shaping people and shaping our society for a century to come.
Yeah.
No question.
All right. Well, we do appreciate people who have mentioned that, they think it's important for us to talk about this story, and I'm glad we did, and we will leave it there. But Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.